Good morning, all. We'll be starting here shortly. We're just letting all the attendees log on, so shouldn't take long at all. Okay. My name is Ed Cook, and I'm going to help facilitate this webinar with Mike today. A couple things I wanted to make you aware of is number one is we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation afterwards. You'll also be getting a brief survey right after the webinar. It's 4 quick questions. We would really appreciate your feedback. And lastly, the better, it seems like the more interactive these webinars are, the more people get out of them. So I'm encouraging to use the question and answer and chat portions at the bottom of your screen. I'll kind of flag Mike that he's got a question. We'll answer it and then we'll move on. So with that, like this is a SCORE webinar. For those of you that don't know SCORE, we are a national nonprofit. We have over 300 chapters, 12,000 volunteers like myself. And besides sponsoring educational workshops like this, our forte is really to be America's counselors to small businesses. So we provide free and confidential counseling. So if you feel like your business isn't running on all 8 cylinders, you can ask for our help, and we would be pretty surgical in addressing your needs. Locally, we have about 40, well, probably closer to 60 volunteers now, and they each have a very unique business sense, business skill set that we can call on. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, and we'll begin his presentation.
Hey, thanks, Ed. You want to move to the next slide? There we go. Okay, well, by the way, you see that ancient typewriter on this slide. I was asked if I ever used one quite that old. Close, maybe. My Army service was as a correspondent, and when I had to go into the DMZ, I often had to send reports back. I had a clumsy old typewriter and one of those cranking field phones that you might have seen Radar using on MASH. So that tells you, yeah, I served over half a century ago, so I'm pretty ancient. Next slide. I will say, as you look at this, I've been asked many times, did I always want to write a book? And the answer to that was no. It was really only as I was moving far along in my business career that I had the idea for one. And the idea actually was an epiphany. I had an aunt, she lived to be 100. In the late 1990s, she sent me a photograph, and it was one of 8 young men who had just been ordained priests back in about 1940. And one of them was my Uncle George. And he and I had become close, and I had started to give thought to the kind of career he had as a priest. And I thought, wow, if I take some kernels from his life, I think I might be able to write a book about World War II that would be different from all the other thousands of books that have been written about World War II. And that became the book that you see in the upper left corner, Warrior Priest. Next slide. Okay. Joining the multitude. You know, after I wrote my first book, I began hearing from lots of folks who would say something like, I'd like to write a book, or I have an idea for a book. And some of you might fall into that category. If you haven't written one, you've had an idea for one, and but you haven't gotten started. Next slide. If you do decide to write one, you're going to join a minority, although it is a very fast growing minority. Just stop for a moment and ask yourself, how many new book titles do you think are released in the United States every year? I'll give you a clue. It has been growing extremely rapidly, and that's the result of some advances in technology that make getting a book published a lot easier than it ever was before. The answer is, each year in this country, there are about 1 million new book titles released. And they cover all genres, you know, biographies, histories, romance novels, historical novels, cookbooks, children's books. But when I tell people when you start writing a book, you can expect there's a lot of stiff competition to get the attention of people who might read your book, given all those 1 million titles that are released each year. Next slide. Okay, this is a really important slide. I have counseled over 60 first-time authors, and I ask them usually, so what kind of a book do you have in mind? What are your goals for the book? And some people have a very clear vision of the kind of book they want to write, and some don't. They just have sort of a general or rather vague idea. But as you're going to learn, these questions that I'm posing on this slide are ones that should be central to your thinking about any book that you want to write and get published. So you want to think about the kind of book, or in other words, the genre. You should ask yourself specifically, what goals do you have for a book? And your age it could actually enter into how you want to proceed with regard to getting a book published. And the same is true of your personality. You'll see below then that question, are you going to be seeking fame and fortune? We'll touch on that later. And are you willing and able to get cracking on marketing your own book? That's also something that we'll cover more in detail. But if you ask yourselves these questions, you're going to bring more focus to your thinking, and you're going to increase the chances that you're going to write a book that you are going to be satisfied with before you move ahead with regard to getting it published. Next slide.
I think we're going to jump in and ask a poll question here. You should all see a question on your screen. What are your goals for the book? If you could answer those, that would be great. Looks like 80, looks like about 85% looks like they're more interested in informing a specific group about something else.
Mm.
Second highest vote was to tell your story. So
okay, good.
Thank you all.
That's good. Okay, so we're looking at a slide that says getting started. Okay, so the first point there, the first bullet, no single way fits everyone. I will describe the way I get started on any book that I write. So what's my way? Well, I start with research, and it happens to be a process that I enjoy. In fact, I regard research as something of a treasure hunt. When I begin, you know, I'm not always sure what I'm going to find, but when I find it can be very exciting. And then I see myself doing 6 kinds of research. Really, one of them begins with what I call personal knowledge. These are things you've seen or witnessed, places you've been. And an example of that for me was a visit to Auschwitz. And at the time I visited it, I really wasn't thinking of ever using Auschwitz in one of my books. But later I did, and you know, I won't go into detail here. I decided to treat it not focusing once more on all the horrors of Auschwitz, but focusing on the escapes. And most Americans have no idea about the number of escape attempts or the ones that were successful. And then the next category for me is on-site research. Clearly, authors don't have to visit sites that they want to talk about, but in my experience, doing so just adds to your ability to create the kind of detail that engages readers. And I'm thinking of a man who just died in his mid-90s, who was the president of Ohio University when I was a student all those decades ago. And he's read all my books. And after reading one of them, he sent me a handwritten letter that started out by saying, "I've read this book twice already." And he went on to say why. And he said it was because he really liked how much I knew about cities, about streets, about buildings, the kind of detail that you can't capture unless you've been to a place. And a couple of my favorite on-site examples, I have a friend, a British friend, who might be on this morning with this webinar, but I wanted to feature the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He's a graduate, and he arranged for me to visit. It was magnificent. And Singapore is also a venue in one of my books. So I went there and I decided I wanted to scale the highest point in Singapore, which is just about the same height as the Washington Monument and just about as steep, but with no elevator. But I wanted to get to the top so I would have some feel for what it was like to be a soldier, either defending it or attacking it in the heat and humidity of Singapore. Another category of the research, documents. Those could be books, they could be maps, they could be movies. And of course, there's the internet, and it has proven a godsend in terms of what it can turn up for me. An example there is in one of my books, I wanted to feature a Polish general by the name of Stanislaw Sosabowski. He was really a terrific leader. And I thought, well, gee, how much can I learn about him? And I don't think it took me more than about 10 minutes of Googling, and I found a biography of him that had been written by his son. Another good example, in one of my books, I wanted to write about D-Day, but from the Navy perspective. And again, in a matter of minutes, I found the very first United States vessel to fire on occupied France on June 6th, and I learned what happened to it. It did not survive. It was shot up and blown up. Another category are friends. I have friends who've been eager to help me. And one of them is a French friend. She lives in a village that I'm very fond of in eastern France. And although I've been there a number of times, I emailed saying, is it possible for me to get a map of the village and get one that's actually annotated in English? And a couple of weeks later, my snail mail included just such a map. So friends have proven immensely valuable to me. And my last category of research I call luck. In one of my books, I wanted to depict what it would be like to hunt a mountain lion who was preying on the sheep of some Indians on a reservation. And I was having difficulty finding what I was really looking for. And then one Sunday morning, I picked up my morning paper in the driveway, and on the opening page of the travel section, it had a big article about mountain lions, which happened to answer all the questions I had. So anyway, I devote a lot of time to research before I start writing anything. And then I start with an outline. Lots of people don't like the trouble with outlines. I find them immensely valuable, and some of my outlines run 40 pages, although that's a little misleading when I say that, because I leave lots of white space in my outline so that I have a space to plug in additional facts that I uncover. And then I also have what I call my ping pong table approach. Once I've got that outline created, I spread it out on a standard size ping pong table, and I put a step stool beside the table, which enables me to step up and look down on the entire outline, or the entire story, if you will, at once. And then across the top of the outline, I have research sources that I've used, and I'm able to look at those, which are coded, and plug in certain pieces of research into the outline. Now here's something I wasn't planning to do when I started my first book. I sat in front of a computer and started tapping away, had the outline beside me, but it took me only a few minutes to realize that I wasn't getting the connection I wanted between my thoughts and the words that were appearing on the screen. So just as an experiment, I picked up a yellow line legal pad and a pen and began writing. And again, within a few minutes, I had the realization that, wow, I'm getting a much stronger connection between my thoughts and the words that are appearing. And later, as I made my way up the learning curve of writing books, I learned that there are quite a few authors to this day who write first drafts longhand. And after writing a draft longhand, then I'm perfectly comfortable with entering it into a computer where I do any editing or even any rewriting. And then edits. Gee, it's up to an individual writer, but I must give each of my manuscripts at least 6 run-throughs of editing. And we'll talk more about editing later on here. Next slide. Rules for writing. I'm chuckling because of what I say in that first bullet. To me, the only rules that you need to pay attention to are the ones that you establish for yourself. And that was actually not an original thought. It was quite a few years ago that the Wall Street Journal had a columnist writing a column about writing. And he started by saying a lot of people get tied up in what are often cited as the general rules for writing. And he said in his mind, the only rule worth really keeping in mind were the rules that he made up for himself. And I think he's right. And that's what I've done for myself. So you can see some of my own rules, if you will. One of them is I try to engage a reader with the first paragraph, or even in some cases, the first sentence. It's sort of like figuratively grabbing a reader by the lapels and pulling him into your book and keeping him or her there. I also pay a lot of attention to pace. I really want to keep readers engaged from the first page all the way to the last page. So you'll find that most of my books have pretty short chapters. And by what is short? Well, a couple pages, several pages, but you won't find any 20-page chapters in my books. And in fact, when I finish writing on a day, I know exactly how I'm going to start the next day. And then I prefer writing in the third person, especially if I'm writing something that has drama in it. And of course, if you're writing in the first person, well, you diminish the drama, right? That people know the narrator has to survive if he's telling the story. So it's my own personal preference. And let me emphasize here that, again, each writer, could and should establish his or her own rules for writing. And then there are certain things that probably my high school English grammar teacher would blanch at. So I use them judiciously, but I'm talking about the things you see here, using incomplete sentences. I don't worry about splitting an infinitive if I think it makes it easier to read. It doesn't bother me now and then to close a sentence with a preposition, and so on. And that last bullet, again, for me is very important. I have never, in those books I've written, consulted a thesaurus. If the word that I believe would prove effective doesn't come to me, I don't go looking for it. I'm not writing to show off vocabulary, whether it's mine or one belonging to the thesaurus. So although I was given an unabridged thesaurus as a high school graduation present, it's in pristine condition because I've never used it. All right, next slide. Editing. I have, as I said, counseled over 60 first-time authors. And probably a dozen of them have asked me if I would review their manuscripts. And some of those manuscripts have been quite good, and several of those people have finished the process. They've got a book, and they've been nice enough to send me an inscribed copy of the book. But some of those manuscripts I get are just begging for extensive editing. And so I tell somebody, don't go solo if you're writing a book. Make sure you've got an experienced and skilled editor. I was actually quite fortunate in that my wife was a skilled editor. She was a managing editor for one magazine. She was a technical editor for a Atomic Power Laboratory. So, and then I had a former colleague who had a lot of experience in editing. So I had two people who edited all of my books. And so the thing that I like to see is a book that doesn't have glitches in it. And it's really tough if you're writing a lengthy book to not have a few glitches. So it's good to have people that are poring over your manuscript. And here's something, I pose this question: do readers actually notice glitches? And for the most part, if they're really engaged in the book, I don't think they do. But there certainly are exceptions to that, because I've had a few readers send me an email or write me a letter saying, gee, it was really a terrific book, but why on page 83, you did this or that. And I look and I say, by George, you're right, that was a glitch. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so now you've got a book, you're happy with it. You're just thirsting to see it actually get published. And so which way do you go? I want to stress before we go any further that there is no perfect way to get a book published. Every one of them, and there you're going to see soon, there are several ways these days. Every one of them has pros and cons. The more research you do into the way books get published, the more satisfied you're going to be with the outcome. Next slide. Okay. That first bullet tells us that today publishing is what I call a more democratic process than was true in bygone years. Up until about the mid-1990s, there were just two ways to get a book published. One is generally referred to as traditional, and the other vanity. Okay, so what does traditional mean? Well, in its essence, it means that you decide to go hunting for an agent. And that agent will then, on accepting your manuscript, set about trying to find a publisher who will accept your manuscript. Okay, that was traditional. Vanity, that meant that you went to a company. There is actually still one existing here in Ohio called Bookmasters. It's based in Ashland, Ohio. In the case of vanity, you would actually sign a contract with a vanity publisher for the publisher to design your book and get it produced, and you would have to contract to buy a certain number of copies. Now let's look at those two ways. Traditionally, if you did find an agent and the agent did find a publisher who wanted to take on your book, wow, you've just had a lot of work taken away from you, things that you no longer have to be concerned about. What might be the drawbacks of going that way? Well, for some people, there aren't any, especially if you're really young and you're really patient. But the reality is, if you're a first-time author, you could easily spend a couple of years finding an agent who'd be willing to take on your work. Why is that? Well, agents much prefer to deal with established authors. And if the agent does accept you as a first-time author, it's probably going to take that agent easily another year or two to find a publisher which will want to take on your book. And for the same reason, the agent is a little reluctant, because publishers would much rather publish books by John Grisham or J.K. Rowling. Okay. Vanity, there actually are a small number of ways or a small number of people who can get value from this. But to me, the cons of going vanity were just way outnumbering the pros. In vanity, you would, remember, contract to buy a certain number of those books, and guess what? It was entirely up to you to market those books. And remember, until relatively recent years, there was no such thing as social media. You could wind up with a garage full of books that you're not moving. And you've invested a lot of money to get those books designed and produced. Now, one man, he's now deceased, sadly, a very good friend, he actually, for a couple of his books, used vanity. Why? He was a professor, and he knew that other professors would order their students to buy his book. And the vanity publisher would then serve as his distributor. So for him, Vanity was a good route for a couple of his books. He also went traditional. I did have one SCORE client who came seeking some help on marketing books. And during the course of the conversation, it was sounding like he had gone the Vanity route. And I asked him that, and he said, well, yes. And he actually named the company, which I heard of. And so I pointed out to him the realities of it. And you could see panic growing into his visage. And he said, can I make a phone call? I said, yeah. Well, the phone call, he hadn't yet signed the contract. He had a partner, and he wanted to make sure the partner hadn't signed the contract yet either. Okay, so that was basic. Those two were the only choices people had for many years. But in the mid-1990s, a new technology was born, and it wasn't born to produce books as we think of books, but it was called desktop publishing. And I first became aware of it in the mid-1990s when the company I was working at was competing with another global company to win the right to privatize a company in Romania. And we learned that we really had to persuade 6 very senior government officials in Romania that we should be the choice. And I had this idea, well, geez, you know, maybe I could produce a case for our company. And oh, by the way, the president said, could I get this done in 6 weeks? I said, sure. And after I hung up, I thought, yeah, how am I going to do that? Well, a young fellow that I'd recently recruited to join our team said, hey, Mike, he said, are you familiar with desktop publishing? I said, no. He said, well, here's the way it works. You develop all the content you want for that, text, charts, photographs, and I'll sit in front of my computer and I'm going to upload it to a desktop publishing company. I said, okay. And within a week after I handed off the content, I was looking at about 10 copies, 6 that we really needed and 3 or 4 extras, a comprehensive case for why the government of Romania should pick us over our competitor. The good news is they did pick us. Well, some alert entrepreneurs in looking at this technology thought, well, wait a minute, are we looking at another way for books to get published? And initially they called it print on demand, which by the way, very much exists today. It's a way that lots of authors choose to go. And in fact, a lot of established authors' books are now printed on demand. It spares creating a big inventory of books. And then it has been known by 2 other names, as you see there, self-publishing or independent publishing. Those three terms, print on demand, self-publishing, independent publishing, they're used interchangeably. I really don't like self-publishing because I know of no way you can get published solely on your own. You do need help from other sources, including publishers. It's just that there are different kinds of publishers. Okay, then came online publishing, and it has been largely responsible for the explosion in the number of titles that are released each year. Simply put, you connect with an online publisher, you sit at your computer, you look at templates for cover designs that are available, you choose one, you look at templates for the interior design of your book, you choose one, and you begin uploading. In some instances, there's absolutely no charge for doing this. Others there are. So what are the advantages of that? Well, it's fast. And it can be very inexpensive, but there are limitations. One of them is those templates. You're not going to get custom design of a dust jacket or your interior. In some cases, you could only have soft covers, which may prove satisfying for most people, but others, you do want hard covers. And by the way, all of my books are available in hardcover, softcover, and ebook. In the case of Amazon, which bought an early online publisher called Lulu, that's L-U-L-U, if you went with Lulu, the only place where your book could be available was Amazon. Well, that's not a tremendous drawback since Amazon has the biggest share of the market, but it does mean, for example, that you wouldn't be at barnesandnoble.com or abebooks.com and so on. So just keep in mind what I said about no perfect way to get your book published. And lastly, I say there's what I call small niche publishing. This is really a good way to go for people who really aren't terribly interested in seeing their books sold at retail, but they do want a really great looking book given the same tender loving care as any book sold at retail, for a book that they really want to make available to their family members and friends. I happen to have a friend who, as a sideline, working with a designer, has done a number of these books, and you would not tell the slight difference between those books and books you would buy at retail. There, you would pay a fee to get the book designed, and you'd have to pay for any copies you wanted from the printing company. But a goodly number of people choose to go that way, and it's something to keep in mind depending on what goals you have for your book. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how did I go about making my choice? Well, first of all, I need to say that I had 3 previously published authors who served as my cheerleaders and my coaches. One is a woman named Claire Ansberry. She's the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal in Pittsburgh. Gee, we got to know each other quite well starting at least 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And Claire has written at least a couple books, and I have nicely inscribed copies of them. One of my favorites is The Women of Troy Hill. But she was more than happy to, again, serve as a coach and cheerleader. Another was a fellow named Bill Hincher. He's now deceased, but he was my first mentor when I was starting my business career with General Electric back in New York, back in the late 60s. Bill, a really good-looking, tall, well-built guy, his specialty was cookbooks. And Bill was he was the first person that I ever knew who went with the print-on-demand process, and he was very pleased with how that was working out. And the third person was a man named Mel Helitzer. He's also deceased. He was a professor at Ohio University, and we got to know each other as I guest lectured for him, I don't know, 30 or so times. I stayed at his home often enough that I called it the Helitzer Hilton. But Mel had books printed traditionally, got an agent who got him published. And he's the fellow I mentioned earlier who also, though, went to Vanity Press for a couple of his books, which he knew would be purchased by students at other universities when required to do so by their publishers. All 3 of these were very helpful in serving as the coaches and the cheerleaders. Also, it just so happened that as I was getting interested in writing a book, the Wall Street Journal was taking note of this print-on-demand way of getting books published. So it ran a series of articles, and I found out those articles immensely helpful too. Then the businessman in me decided, what the heck? I phoned the 3 largest print-on-demand publishing companies at the time. I asked to speak with someone who could talk to me about their business models. So I spoke to them in depth, all 3 of them. And then I let a few days go by, and I picked up the phone and called all 3 of them again. And so I was actually interviewing them as I was thinking about perhaps going the print-on-demand route. Well, that is the route I took. And why did I go that route? Well, first of all, I was approaching age 60, and I didn't like the idea that if I started searching for an agent, that might take a couple of years, and if he found a publisher, that might take a couple of years, and another year would go by, and I'm thinking, do I really want to be 65 years old before a first book comes out? Well, the answer to that was pretty easy. And then I also liked the fact that the print-on-demand publisher that I actually chose would see to it that my book reached book distribution companies. And those are companies that most Americans never heard about, but they're the ones who serve as the link between a publisher and a retailer. The 2 biggest of the book distribution companies are Ingram and Baker and Taylor. And so I like like knowing that the publisher would see to it that my books got to those book distribution companies. And when I say got to them, that meant that they would be transmitting the dust jacket and a synopsis of the book. In fact, if you went to Amazon today to look up any book, when you see the dust jacket cover and a synopsis, you know it got there through one of the book distribution companies. Well, and then I was also given, so I was interested in speed. You know, I was pushing 60. I liked the fact that that this company was going to do certain things for me that would be central. I liked the fact that there were people there who knew what they were doing. I liked the fact that they were going to look at their design teams and choose one to work with me, because I did want a custom design both for the dust jacket and the interior of the book. And then there were my goals for the book, and I had several. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to see if I could write one book about World War II that would be different from all the thousands of other books written about the war. I wanted the book to provide perspectives that were virtually unknown among Americans. I wanted a book that would, educate and entertain. I wanted a book that would actually move people to think about the kind of life they're living today, how it might have been influenced by the people who fought in those wars. And later, not initially, but later, I established as a goal, and I'll talk more about this later, but satisfying the IRS requirement for my book writing to be treated as a business and not a hobby. So this gets back to, what kind of goals do you want to write for any book what kind of goals do you want to have for any book you write? And I can't emphasize enough how beneficial it is to you, the author, to have that kind of a focus. Okay, next slide. We're going backwards, Gwen. Keep going. All right, whoops. Marketing your book. This is something that it actually frightens some authors I've talked to. They don't see themselves as marketers. But let me tell you that any respectable publisher, any kind of respectable publisher, should tell an author, you need to be central to the marketing of your book if you want to see that book get in the hands of readers. Okay.
Hey, Mike, I'm going to break in here. We've got
okay, go ahead.
Question.
Go ahead.
If you all could take a time and respond, that'd be great. So right now about, I want to be very, very much want to be involved is where the votes are right now. And then only if I have to 18%, 82 for the other. So thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Okay. We're doing okay too, Ed. I've got my eye on my watch here.
All right,
hey, you see that first bullet? It says overcome an innate sense of modesty. Most of us, I believe, do have an innate sense of modesty. And I actually first realized it when my first book had been released, and I knew I'd be taking to heart that I would have to be central to marketing the book. Again, even the John Grishams and the J.K. Rowlings, with all their success, they do remain central to marketing their books. Most of us as first-time authors, though, are not going to find ourselves sitting next to Oprah Winfrey or being invited on the Today Show or whatever. So the first thing I thought was, I have a quite extensive email network. I'd say maybe 3,000 people with whom I've been in touch in regard to the various involvements I have. And I thought, okay, I'm going to start letting those people know that I have a book out there. And when I sat in front of the computer to begin that, I was blushing. I felt my face start to heat up and turn red. And I thought, oh my God, is this something I really want to do? I know I need to do it, but do I really want to do it? So it took a little time to get past that innate sense of modesty, but I did. So as I say there, I used email. And initially, it doesn't say it here as a bullet, but I actually created a website. I no longer have the website, and that I suspended it because some years ago I started a Facebook page, and I quickly realized that that was a much more effective way to spread the word about the books. And it has to do with the interactivity on Facebook that you don't see on the typical website. So I've made extensive use of Facebook. Also, I sent review copies to selected newspapers. And these typically are papers that are in cities where I've either lived or worked. In other words, I was able, in sending a copy to a newspaper, to say in a handwritten little note that, you know, I lived there, I lived nearby. And that actually, by the way, was a real key to start spreading the word. And I'm recalling one instance where I took a phone call one day from a woman who introduced herself as the manager of a Barnes and Noble store in Ontario, Ohio. And I said, "Oh, okay, why are you calling?" And she said, "Well, your book was the third best-selling book in our store this past month." And I said, "Yeah, how did that happen?" She said, "Well, the Mansfield paper, you know, ran a really nice review of your book, and we started getting people coming in and asking, so we started ordering copies, and they were selling." So it paid to send copies to, again, papers in cities where I lived or worked, or at least nearby. I also sent review copies to my alma maters. And in fact, two of them actually have special sections on their websites for alumni written books. And that first book that I wrote led to my getting back in touch with my freshman year roommate. It was an era when, upon graduating college, you know, I went in the Army. There was no way to really stay in touch with people. But when the alma mater plugged my book in its publication, he saw it, got in touch with me, and we've since reunited in person and remained in touch. That's also what caused me to get connected with that fellow who was the president of the university when I was a student. And we had quite some really nice correspondence over the years, and we actually met each other twice. And that bottom one, I was not at all, as a rookie author, thinking about speaking invitations. But one day I got a call from a person who introduced himself as the, I think it was like a chairman of the trustees for a library, and said, "Would you think about doing a program for us?" I said, "Okay." So in the end, I wound up doing about 150 programs for almost every kind of an organization that you might be able to think of, ranging from New Neighbors to Military Officers Association to Rotary clubs, and so on, and schools. And I made it my own policy, if you will. I decided I'd already begun working on the second book, and I thought, I really don't want to spend too much time going around to these book programs. So I decided I would only accept invitations that were no more than a 3-hour drive from my home.
Hey, Mike, I'm gonna break in here. I've got a question for you from Javier Parker. He's asking for recommendations on using your own name, or should you use a pseudonym?
Well, that's a very, you know, I can't think of a more personal question. Yeah, there are some authors that use pseudonyms, but not only did I go with my real name, when the design team said, okay, so we'll have the title and it'll say by Michael Johnson, I said, nah, make it Mike Johnson. That's how I'm really known most widely. Generally speaking, I think a person probably should give strong weight to using his or her real name. You know, and for example, I'm talking about speaking invitations. Well, it'd be a little difficult for you to accept a speaking invitation if you're using a pseudonym. So I think it would just be simpler and more effective to use your real name. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, speaking invitations, you know, they just are a marvelous way to spread the word. And by the way, there have been numerous instances where I've received an invitation to go to some town I've never heard of. And I'll say, how did you learn about me? And they'll say, oh, well, I've got a friend in this other city who saw a review of your book in that newspaper, and they called me and said, maybe I should invite you to come. I mean, the word gets around. So next
Hey,
slide.
Mike,
Yeah.
Mike, I have another question for you.
Okay.
Kelly Lawrence wants to know, how do you find an agent?
You know, that's a tough one. It's been about 20 years ago that the Wall Street Journal ran an article, copies of which I've kept, and it's called The End of the Slush Pile. And it talked about how difficult it is to get an agent to pay attention to you principally because the whole publishing industry has had trouble financially going back 20 years ago. There've been all kinds of mergers and acquisitions. Borders, liquidated. Barnes and Noble has been on the cusp of bankruptcy for years. It's a tough business to make money in. And so agents are tough to find. But there are, if you simply go online, I was going to say go to the library, which you could do, but just go online and look up book agents, and you'll find long lists of them. And they will actually tell you the kind of books they're interested in. Some will simply say, not taking on new authors. Others will say, we welcome new authors. But just go online, look up book agents, and you'll find a long list of them. Okay?
Hey, Mike, I've got another question from Donna
Okay.
Radiana. And I think it has to do with whether she should use her own name or not. It's just her name is very long. Any advice there?
Yeah, that's a good question too, because most of my books have settings in other countries. And so I actually look up the most common first and last names in those countries, looking for ones that are easy for Americans to mentally pronounce. Ed, if this is, I'd like to have her email address, if we can somehow get that. Maybe Gwen has it, and respond at greater length on that. Then we don't have that much time left. So if I could have her email address, I'd get back to her personally. And I think Gwen must have that because she was invited to join this webinar.
Gwen does have her.
Okay, good. I'll respond in depth to that one.
One other question from Kelly Lawrence. Any additional advice for an agent or a publisher selection?
Well, I've actually talked about it. Do your homework. Learn as much as you can about different publishers and make a decision which seems rational. I just, the one I went with, I'm hesitating to recognize or recommend a particular one, although I think Gwen has, either it's a slide coming up or she's made names of at least 3 of the print-on-demand publishers available. You just got to do your homework and dig deep. You heard me say that I made a round of phone calls to the 3 big ones, and then I made a second round to dig even deeper before I made a decision. By the way, this reminds me too, I've seen ads recently on TV for, and I think it's a print-on-demand type publisher. And one of the things they're saying is, we'll get your book in bookstores. And I'd say, whoa, wait a minute. What percentage of books that are published these days actually find space on the shelves in bookstores? The answer is not very many. Bookstore space on those shelves is limited. You'll find lots of books there by established authors who have made a real name for themselves. In fact, most people today, where are they doing their shopping? They're not doing it in bookstores. They're doing it at Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Abe. So when I see that ad on TV about we'll get your book in bookstores, I'm a little dubious about how successful they would be with that. So if I were interviewing that company, I would say, all right, tell me what percentage of the books you handle actually wind up on bookstore shelves. This all goes to doing homework. I hate to see somebody invest time and money with a publisher that they're going to wind up being disappointed with. And the more homework you do, the greater the chance you'll avoid being disappointed.
Hey, Mike, I have another couple questions. The first one, another question from Javier Parker. and he's saying he's just heard of a www.5rr.com to hire an editor. Have you ever heard of that? Any recommendations on that?
No, I've never heard of it. I do know that independent book editors, and there are, in fact, if I were Googling, I would Google independent book editors. Boy, they charge what their market will bear. I had one fellow, I remember this goes back a few years, he called me from Arizona. He wanted some counsel, which I always happily provide. And he had gotten a price of, it was like $3,000 from an independent editor. And most first-time authors really don't have that kind of money sitting around to pay an editor, especially when they aren't even sure what kind of editing they're going to get. So in his case, I made him an offer. I said, I'll tell you what, if you pledge to buy one copy of each of my books that I will then send to the library of your choice, that's what I'll charge you for editing your book. And to say he was thrilled is not an exaggeration. At that time, I think I had 6 books out, and I think I charged him $150. So that was quite a savings from the $3,000 he had been quoted.
Sure.
But it's book editing is a time-intensive effort. It does take time, and it's understandable why some independent editors would try to get as much as the market will bear. Okay.
Do you have personally any recommendations? Anyone you use to edit your books?
Well, I told you earlier, I was blessed with having a wife who was an experienced editor, and then this former colleague of mine, who sadly is no longer with us, who was a tremendous editor. So those are the two that edited my books, and so I don't have any personal recommendation on other ones.
Okay. The last question I have right now is from Tom Mornecka. He's asking if you've published a second revised edition of a book that did not sell well.
No, and I was blessed because the first book did sell well. And I'll touch on one of the rewards I got from that, but no, I have not republished. The only author I know of who got great success with reissues was Dan Brown, whose first 2 or 3 books didn't sell well at all. And then it came the Da Vinci Code, and his publisher went back and reissued his earlier books, which of course then started to sell. All right, shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay, book pricing, lessons learned. Hey, who actually controls the price of a book? It's not the publisher. Oh, the publisher will have a barcode with the suggested retail price, but it's the retailer that actually establishes the price of a book. And I learned that this is my 3rd or 4th book. And I got an email from a guy who had said, hey, I've been buying your books, hardcovers, but my wife got me a Kindle, and I thought I needed to experiment by buying an ebook, and I see that you have a new book out. And so I decided to buy the ebook version, and he said, oh, and by the way, geez, it was on sale for $3.99. I thought, whoa, because I knew that the suggested retail was $9.99. So I had become quite close to the CEO of the publisher, and I said, what's going on? He said, yeah, we have a suggested retail price, but Amazon decided they wanted to have a Christmas sale, and yours is one of the books they chose, and it's there for $3.99. That was a lesson learned. Another lesson, though, came with establishing a price or suggested retail price. I remember that my first hardcover edition was priced at $30.99, and my wife was an avid reader, said, yeah, that's for a 420-page hardcover book. That's acceptable. Not long after, I got an email from a fellow who said, hey, I saw this book at Amazon. It really looks great. He said, I don't know if I want to spend $30.99. And I thought, oh, here's an opportunity to pay attention to feedback. So I replied saying, what if you could get an inscribed hardcover for $25 all in included shipping? He said, where do I send the check? Well, I had no idea that there would be a demand for inscribed copies, but here's what I'll say, folks. I have mailed thousands of inscribed copies to virtually every state and over 20 other countries. People want inscribed or signed copies, and they're willing to pay for them. But the lesson was, by by pricing the copies. Authors can buy copies at deep, deep discounts from their publishers. So even at 25 bucks, including shipping, I was clearing a little bit of money. The other lesson I learned started with my second book. Remember, the first book in hardcover was priced at $30.99. I said, hey, what if we drop that retail price down to like 28? And I expected some resistance, but the publishing company person said, okay, Mike. Well, one reason they said, okay, Mike, was because the first book had sold. But anyway, it was a lesson. Hey, you can negotiate with your publisher on suggested retail prices. And then lastly is that the words inscribed copies. There's been a huge demand for those, and it's actually fun. Somebody said, do you ever get tired of writing the inscriptions? The answer to that is no. I enjoy writing them because I hear back from people about how much they value them. Next slide. I got 5 minutes to go, right? Hey, I think we might have missed a slide. I'm not sure, but I did want to say, here's a reality. I'll talk about this one, but I want to talk about who actually makes money when a book is published. There are 5 entities that make money. The first one is your publisher. The second one is the book distribution company. The third one is the printing company. The fourth one is the retailer. Oh, there's that slide. Well, I was told, yeah. So the fourth one is the retailer. And guess who's last? The authors. Okay. Now, so we talk about, so here's who makes money. That's the order in which they make money. So now we say, can you earn some fame when you are publishing a book? And the answer is yes. Word gets around. People who've never heard of you. I've had people who really view me, readers who come to view me as a really close friend. We've never met, we never will. But whenever somebody sends me a reaction to one of the books, I reply. And so there is this measure of fame, and it comes with those newspaper reviews and the plugs in your alumni publications. But then let's go to fortune. The next slide. It's elusive. I was talking to a man, an author who wrote a biography of Harry Truman. He came to a book signing that I was doing in a store, and the store had set up a circle of chairs, and so he was chatting, and when he introduced himself, I said, hey, I've read your book on Harry Truman. I really enjoyed it. He said, yeah, that's great. And then he proceeded to tell me how lots of local people thought he must have made a fortune off that book. And then this goes to that previous slide about, well, who makes money on a book? Well, he was the 5th and final entity to make money on a book. So it's tough to actually achieve fortune on a book. Next slide. Keep going. Keep going. Reader reactions. I view reader reactions as the single most gratifying aspect of writing a book. If I have a couple of minutes here yet, you can see those bullets there, but a couple come to mind. I got an email one day from a woman in Germany, and she said that growing up, she had asked her parents and grandparents how Germany could do the things it did to people during World War II. And she said that they either didn't answer her questions or they were evasive. And then she said, but your 2 books, the 2 she had read, answered all my questions. I got a handwritten letter from a former commanding general of NATO thanking me for the research that I'd done on the books. I've heard from veterans of World War II and the Korean War, or their family members, thanking me for the stories that I've told. Had a high school history teacher email to tell me that he thought my one book was a better way to teach World War II than a textbook. Said he was going to apply to an educational foundation to see if he could get the money to buy copies. 3 or 4 months later, I got another email saying, hey, they approved my request, and I just bought however many copies of your book to give to his students. So I tell people, you know, you're going to experience some things you never expected when you write a book. And yeah, you see that occasional phone calls. I had one gentleman track me down. When you have a name like Mike Johnson, it's not easy to find me. But he found me. It took an expensive search on his part to find me. But he just wanted to talk to me. He wanted to tell me that he had been captured at the Battle of the Bulge and how he felt guilty. And I just listened to him for the better part of an hour. So, okay, let's move on to our last minute. What else do we have left here in my last 60 seconds? This was an unexpected reward, if you will. After my first book came out, I got a call from the CEO of the publishing company saying, what would you think of my forming an author's council? And I said, what would be the purpose? He said, I would establish it to make the publishing process better for authors and publishers. I said, sounds interesting. So we did form a council. I think there were 10 of us, and we were diverse as to race, age, gender, geography, type of books written. We would meet once or twice a year in person in Bloomington, Indiana, where the company is headquartered. One year he took us to flew us all to the Miami International Book Fair, and he had purchased space for several tents, but in one of the tents, he had only the books written by the members of the Authors Council. That was a pretty cool experience. And you can see another time I accepted an invitation to put on a seminar in Indianapolis for first-time authors. I think that drew about, I don't know, 60, 70 people. It went through Saturday and Sunday. So to join this Authors Council was really an unexpected reward. And I just thought I would mention to you that there are these kinds of rewards that come along when you've written a book. Okay, next slide. Right, real quickly. If you want what you're doing with regard to writing books to satisfy the IRS as a business, you need to show what it calls minimal net income in 3 out of 5 years. You really want that if you plan to write more than one book, because it means that all the expenses related to writing the book are going to be tax deductible. And that can be any travels you do for research. It can include buying research materials. It can include buying copies for your own inventory. By the way, publishers do not just hand out unlimited number of copies to you. You got to buy them, but they sell them to you at a deep discount. If your book is regarded by the IRS as a hobby, you don't get to deduct any of that. Okay, last slide, I think it is. Yeah, hey, if you have an idea for a book, get started. But when you do so, work to establish what I call mental momentum. In my mind, that means when you start, you have to work on your book 7 days a week. Not necessarily the same number of hours each day, not necessarily the same location inside your home each day. But if you're going to establish mental momentum, I'd say you've got to work on the book, whether it's the researching, the writing, or the editing, 7 days a week. If you only work at it a day or 2 a week, skip a week, I don't think you're going to be as satisfied with the end product as you would be if you stayed with it and established mental momentum. Third bullet, yes, get it published. Pick one of these ways we've talked about, but get your book published. How gratifying is that? When I received the first advance copy of my first book, my wife and I took it to dinner, and we put it on the table so we could just look at it while we were ordering and dining. So cherish holding that first bound book and be forever glad that you pushed yourself to the finish line. And with that, Ed, I think we just finished.
Sounds good.
Hey, to all you folks who joined in today, thanks, and I hope you did get some useful insights from our session.
Thank you, Mike. Hey, just a reminder, you will get a copy of the presentation through email. And if you could hang on and complete the quick survey, that would be terrific. With that, it's been a pleasure. Thank you all. So long.